Without further ado, part 2, Rabbi Singer.
The Duvna Maggid, who was a sage who lived a number of centuries ago, he was noted as being the master of the metaphor. He was able to communicate complex ideas through a story. He describes a prince who spent most of his life within the parameters of his father's palace. One day, the prince decides that he wants to take a walk into the forest that surround the walls. He leaves and he begins to walk through the forest, and the trees and all the brush, and suddenly, as he's walking in the forest, a place he's never been before, he suddenly notices on one of the trees an archer's target. An archer's target is that target with a circle within a circle, multicolored circle within a circle. And there was an arrow that had already been shot into the target, and the arrow actually was shot. It was a perfect bullseye. The arrow was right in the center circle, but not only was it in the center circle, what really got his curiosity going was that it was right in the center of the center circle, it was right there in the middle. And he really wondered, who was this archer who shot a perfect shot? Well, after a few moments of pondering, he kept walking, and about 25 feet later, he comes upon another tree with, again, the same archer's target right on the tree there, and an arrow shot into it, and the arrow, again, was a perfect bullseye, right in the center of the center circle. Well, at this point, his curiosity was really building his wonder, who was the one who could have shot 2 in a row exactly? After a few moments, he continues, and he comes to a third tree, same thing, perfect bullseye. Now he's already going out of his mind. And then he goes 4th, 5th, 6th. He's finally coming to the 10th tree already, each one perfect bullseye. And there is another tree there, archer's target, arrow shot into it, perfect bullseye. Only this time there's this big fat fellow beneath the tree with another arrow and a bow in his hand. And he runs over to him immediately and says to him, "Man, are you the one that shot all these arrows, all perfect bullseyes, one after the other?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "You're the best archer I've ever seen. There's no one in my father's, who could shoot every one a perfect bullseye." And as he's saying this to the man begins to laugh hysterically. And the prince, of course, becomes indignant. He says, "What's going on? What are you laughing at? What's so funny?" He says, "Let me tell you how I do it. The first thing I do is I take an arrow and I shoot it into a tree. And then I paint the target around it." Christianity did not begin in a vacuum. The founders of the Christian faith saw Christianity as a continuum of the Jewish faith. Fundamentalist Christians will tell you that the New Testament simply dovetails with the Old. The founder, or perhaps the foundling of the Christian faith, Jesus of Nazareth, the claim is made that he is the Messiah. As we discussed in last week's lecture, the idea of a Messiah is exclusively a Jewish one. And therefore, where in all of Jewish literature would you find a description of the Messiah, a description of the Messianic age, most importantly, a job description of the Messiah? Obviously, it would have to be in the Jewish scriptures. Therefore, it was absolutely necessary, absolutely essential for the fathers of the Christian faith, for the founders of the Christian faith, to take the Jewish scriptures and manipulate it in order so that Jesus' life fits into its parameters, and that at times the Jewish scriptures have to be manipulated in order to fit it into Jesus' own life. Tonight's lecture is therefore called Let's Get Biblical. How do missionaries paint Jesus into the Jewish scriptures? Now, I will tell you that the time lot that I have does not permit me to go through every single element within polemical scholarship. Just not possible. What we are going to do this evening is I'm going to take you by the hand, and we're going to go on a journey. We're going to navigate throughout what we call the Tanach. We're going to look through the Jewish sacred scriptures, and we're going to look at the different methods that missionaries have used throughout the centuries in order to convince our most vulnerable Jews that indeed the Jewish prophets spoke of no other one than Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the first method we're going to look at this evening, and it's essentially, look at this one first, is a method called simply taking something out of its original context. It's essential because this method is so pervasive, you will find that it has infiltrated every element of polemical scholarship. Now, sometimes when I'm lecturing, right away someone's hand goes flying up in the air and they say, Rabbi, when you say take something out of context, what exactly do you mean? So what I want to do is begin with just an example. This is not a big deal. This is nothing for anyone to get excited over. I just want to give you an example of what I mean so that when I use the term this evening, take something out of context, you'll have a model with which to measure it against. Let me give you an example. In the book of Matthew, chapter 2, and by the way, we are going to be speaking about the book of Matthew a lot this evening, simply because although within the Gospels which describe basically at times the birth, and specifically with regards to Matthew and Luke, the birth, life, ministry, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, within the four Gospels, Matthew, more than any of the other three, is likely to not only give us an example of something that Jesus did, but he is going to also show us a verse in the Jewish scriptures to support it. You may have the same story told in the book of Luke and in the book of Matthew. Whereas Luke just tells us that Jesus did this thing, Matthew will not only tell us that Jesus did this, Matthew will support it by the Jewish scriptures. Therefore, we're going to be spending some time with Matthew this evening. Now, right in the beginning of the book of Matthew, we have a narrative, we have a story that's unfolding in chapter 2. It's chapter 2, verse 13 through 15. Now, before we look at it inside, I just want to describe to you, give you some background, then we'll actually look at it inside. Tell you what's going on there. What's taking place is that, of course, Jesus is already born. He's a very little tot. And there's a man named Herod the Great. Herod the Great doesn't have a reputation for being a nice guy, kind of fellow that's likely to wipe out his family. And Herod the Great finds out through astrologers that there is this little boy who's born in Bethlehem. And this little boy basically is going to usurp his power. What happens? Jesus has to be protected. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord comes to Jesus by night in a dream and comes to Joseph by night in a dream and says to him, "Thou son of David, take Jesus and his mother by night and whisk him away, bring him to Egypt and keep him there." Basically, keep little Jesus in Egypt until basically the coast is clear when you can bring him back. Okay? And of course, Matthew tells us the story of Jesus as a little one being brought to Egypt in order to escape the sword of escape the sword of Herod. And he gives us a verse in the Jewish scriptures so that we should understand that the Messiah being brought to Egypt was not an arbitrary event that takes place in Jesus' life and the life of the Messiah. No, it is the prophets, the Jewish prophets actually spoke of the Messiah being brought to Egypt. When they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeareth to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise, and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word. For Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. Verse 14, when he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt. Verse 15, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. It's a very simple story. You will understand. It's not a very complicated story. Jesus is taken out of the land of Israel, brought from Bethlehem, brought to Egypt, and kept there until the coast is clear. And the angel is the one who really is directing the show. And indeed it's done. And this, of course, as I said earlier, is not an arbitrary event. The Messiah is supposed to do that. And the proof of it is that Matthew actually brings a verse from the Jewish scriptures to demonstrate to us that the Messiah is supposed to be brought to Egypt. Now, I will tell you that Matthew is doing something here that is rather unusual. Simply spoken, what is unusual about this quotation is that Matthew only quotes half the verse. He only quotes the second half of the verse. He doesn't quote the verse in its entirety. That's rather unusual. Usually when you're quoting a verse, you quote the entire verse. You leave 3 dots, perhaps, so we know there's something else left. But somehow Matthew does not quote this verse in its entirety. By the way, Matthew couldn't quote this verse in its entirety, because had Matthew just taken the trouble to quote this verse just in its entirety, it would become clear to the reader that this in no way is referring to the Messiah. And therefore, Matthew had to take the verse, chop it in half, and only give you half the verse so that it can possibly make sense that this is referring to the Messiah. Now, if you had a Christian study Bible with footnotes telling you where to look, the Christian Bible, if you were open to Matthew chapter 2, verse 15, would tell you to look in the book of Hosea, the Jewish prophet, chapter 11, verse 1. Now, I've done the homework for you. You've got the handout in front of you. It's on the upper right-hand side. Let's take a look at that verse in its entirety. When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt. So what is clear now is that this verse in no way is referring to the Messiah. It is, on the contrary, referring to Israel, referring to the Jewish people. Now it becomes clear why Matthew couldn't possibly have just quoted that half of the verse. What's even funnier is that the verse is actually misapplied, in that the verse actually, if you look carefully at the verse that you find in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, you'll realize that it's not really referring to someone going from Israel and being whisked into the land of Egypt. It's actually not referring to an entrance into Egypt. The verse that comes from Hosea 11:1 is actually referring to an exodus from Egypt. Now, I don't want to get into a whole big deal with this thing with Matthew chapter 2, 13 through 15. This was only an example. This is no big deal, okay? This was only an example so that tonight you will understand what I mean when I say take something out of context. Usually, the verse is taken out of context so that when you read an entire verse, you'll know what it's referring to, or certainly if you read just a few verses earlier or a few verses afterwards, okay? Now, what I'd like to do now is let's get a little juicy. That means let's get into the meat here. Let's get into the stuff that missionaries are using. Let's get into stuff that are, well, let's get our hands dirty. There's a verse that appears in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah, of course, was a Jewish prophet, one of the very last of the Jewish prophets. And in the book of Zechariah, chapter 13, verse 6, there's a very unusual verse, and I'd like to read it with you. If you'll direct your attention to the extreme lower left-hand corner of the page. Now, we're going right to the bottom, the very last verse. I just want to read it to you. It's verse 6. This is right out of the King James. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? Then he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Again. And one shall say to him, what are these wounds in thine hands? Then he shall say, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Ladies and gentlemen, who is that speaking about? Louder? Okay, let me ask the question a little differently. And I'll be honest, and then the Jewish people, just be straight away. What is that verse? Who does that verse sound like it's talking about? Clearly sounds like it's talking about Jesus, because it's very clear, the one with the wounded hands. And if you asked him where did he receive those wounds, he would tell you he received them in the house of his friends. If you think back in world history, I mean, could anyone here think of anyone else who is noted for having the wounds in his hands and he received them in the house of his friends? And I will repeat, Zechariah is a Jewish prophet. He lived, it depends whose chronology you use, whose counting you use. If you use the secular one, it's about 600 years before Jesus. If you use a Jewish one, it's a little less than 500. But we're talking about long before Jesus. We have the Jewish prophet telling us about the one with the wounds in his hands. And he received them in the house of his friends or the house of his lovers. Now, sometimes people, I know some of you think, Rabbi, I know, you're gonna pull a juicy one here, aren't you? There's probably some word in this verse that's mistranslated, isn't there? You're going to show it to us, aren't you? Well, no, I'm not, because the verse, if those of you are familiar with the Hebrew language, I've given it to you on the right side, and if you look at it, you'll see that the King James translates that verse fairly well. There's really no real mistranslation in the verse. Okay, Rabbi, I know what you're going to show me. You're going to show us now. Go ahead, do it now. You're going to show us how this is taken out of context, meaning that Zechariah chapter 13 and the surrounding chapters and verses they are not messianic. This is not a messianic context. This is going to be someone else that I just didn't learn about in Hebrew school, right? Well, not exactly. Zechariah 13 is entirely messianic, so is Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14. This verse is one of the most popular verses used by missionaries in order to demonstrate that Jesus was indeed, the crucifixion was foretold by the Jewish prophets. Josh McDowell, one of the most famous and well-known Christian apologists, certainly fundamentalist Christian apologists, lists this verse as one of the most important verses that demonstrate that the crucifixion was spoken of by the Jewish prophets. He does that in his most important work, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, on page 160, 176, and 177. Even if you open a Thompson's Chain Reference Bible, mainstream kind of, you look at Zechariah 13:6, look on the left side, it says the sufferings of Jesus. Zechariah 13. So this is something that's used. As a matter of fact, one of the most important missionaries on the East Coast, one of the most well-known missionaries on the East Coast, his name is Sid Roth. He actually runs a Messianic congregation in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. Sid Roth has a very, very elaborate ministry that's out of Gaithersburg, Maryland. It's called Messianic Vision. And he has a whole variety of tapes and booklets that really train people and give people advice on how to convert Jewish people. Now, there are a lot of fundamentalist Christians that, although, as they would say, their heart is circumcised for the Jewish people, they're a little, they're like a little embarrassed about really openly evangelizing them. They want to, get along with their next door neighbor. They don't really. So what Sid Roth designed was a cassette tape. He designed a cassette tape, a very well-known cassette tape called Secrets from the Jewish Scriptures. And essentially what this cassette tape does is it goes through the different verses that Sid Roth has put in there that he believes is speaking about Jesus. And what the beauty of it is that a fundamentalist Christian can give it to their Jewish coworker, Jewish friend, Jewish neighbor, and say, here, listen to this tape. There is no quote in that tape from the New Testament. And that's why Sid Roth felt, and many Christians felt, that it's less offensive than the standard evangelism. I want to play for you, I just want to play this for you, just this part from the tape.
And should someone say unto him, what are these wounds between thy hands? Then will he say, those with which I have been wounded in the house of my friends.
Not bad, huh? Nice music, okay. If we stop and think about it, it would probably be very difficult for us, and I want to be honest with you, it would probably be quite difficult for us to conjure up someone else who fits into that prophecy at least as neatly as Jesus does. I mean, that's something that I think I need to admit. As a matter of fact, we have to be honest here, I do at least, and I believe that that verse is speaking about Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I saw two people in the back there looking at the thing. Honey, did we come to the right place? Are you sure this, when we came in here? No, you came to the right place. That's not the problem here. The mistake is that you failed to read it in context. No, it's too late over there. You're in the middle. It's too late now. You see, did you ever wonder to yourself, what is going to happen at the end of days to the false prophets? What is the Reverend Sung Young Moon going to say when the real Messiah comes? What exactly are these people? What is going to be on the lips of all the false? I mean, we know one of the most important prophecies in the Bible, messianic prophecies, by the way, that all Christians and Jews agree are messianic, is the universal knowledge of God, that there will not be a multiplicity of religions taking place, but there will be one nation, right? All the Gentiles of the world will come to the Jew. Zechariah 8:23, 10 Gentiles of different languages will grab the shirt of Jew and say, take us with you, because now we we know that God is with you? We don't have Jeremiah 31, 34, right? In those days, right? No one's going to have to tell his brother about God, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, says the Lord. So we know clearly from the Bible that one of the things we will find is that all other nations of the world are going to drop their understandings of God, and they're going to replace them with the Jewish one. And they will all come up to the mountain of the Lord, Isaiah 2, and out of the right, and out of Zion will come forth the law. I mean, it's very strange. Well, what are all the false prophets going to say? And that's what Zechariah 13 is all about. Zechariah 13 begins with the statement of when the fountain will be opened to the house of David, messianic. And then God is going to cleanse the land. All the unclean spirits and all the prophets are going to be cleaned out of the land. It's interesting, Zechariah points out that at the end of days, if at the end of days there's, imagine a prophet who still has the chutzpah, whatever, that he still prophesies, chutzpah by, not from New York, audacity. He still has the audacity to still be prophesying. The Messiah's already here, right? So what does Zechariah say? That he's still on 5th Avenue and 34th Street with his blackboard there. So what does he say? He says that his own parents are going to put him to death. They'll say to him, you shall not live, you speak lies in the name of the Lord. And then they'll come forth and they will all be deeply ashamed of their vision. But then Zechariah comes down to one who is very deeply ashamed of his vision. Well, why am I speaking? Let's take a look inside. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at Zechariah 13, but now from verse 1 through verse 6. In that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanliness. And it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will cut off the names of the idols out of the land, and they shall no more be remembered. And also I will cause the prophets and the unclean spirit to pass out of the land. And it shall come to pass that, when any shall yet prophesy, then his father and his mother that begot him shall say unto him, Thou shalt not live, for thou speakest lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and his mother that begot him shall thrust him through when he prophesieth. And it shall come to pass in that day that the prophet shall be ashamed every one of his vision when he hath prophesied. Neither shall they wear a rough garment to deceive, but he shall say, I am no prophet, I am a husband, for man taught me to keep cattle from my youth. And one shall say unto him, What are these wounds in thine hands? Then he shall answer, Those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. See the difference when you read it in context and you read it out of context? What's funny is that there's one area of Christian scholarship that's, of course, promoting this verse. Hey, we got a great verse for Jesus. And then you got a lot of scholarship that's a little more honest and saying, look, we're willing to give up a verse for honesty and saying, don't do that. For instance, the Liberty Bible commentary put out by Liberty University, Jerry Falwell's, they say there in the commentary, he says, heaven forbid that anyone should say that this is speaking about the Lord Jesus Christ, because if you say that it's blasphemy, he's speaking about the Lord, he's a false prophet, right? He gets all upset, So you have some of the more honest Christians that are saying, look, don't say this, because then we're in big trouble. It's Gahak the Tzaris if you're telling us that this is talking about Jesus. What's funnier is the NIV, New International Version, one of the more well-known commercialized Christian translations of the Bible, sometimes could be a nice word, the delicate word, sleazy, I don't know. Sometimes the NIV will try to cover the problems. We'll see that tonight, and in many of the other lectures in the tapes, you'll see that over and over again. What's funny is the NIV at this verse over here, and one shall say they realize the problem here. So when it says, what are those wounds in thine hands? In the NIV it doesn't say that. It says, what are those wounds in thy body? And then there's like a letter Q that you need an electron microscope to swing over to read it. And then you have to go to the lower right-hand corner of the page over there. You need a passport to get there. And if it says, well, literally Hebrew, it means hands. Well, why didn't you say so in the first place? What are you worried about if you say hands and it sounds like it's speaking about Jesus? I want to read a verse to you. It comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 22, verse 17, in a Jewish translation, or in a Jewish Bible. And this happens sometimes where you'll have the same verse, but in a Christian Bible, it will be one verse different than the Jewish Bible. And that's okay. We all recognize that sometimes we divvy up the verses a little differently. Even at times we divide up the chapters differently. In this case, the verse in question is Psalm 22. In a Jewish Bible, it's verse 17. In a Christian Bible, it's verse 16. I want to read it to you as it appears in a Jewish translation. This actually is Sansino, done by Jewish scholars. how they translated verse 17. For dogs have encompassed me, a company of evildoers have enclosed me. Like a lion, they're at my hands and my feet. Ladies and gentlemen, who does that sound like it's talking about? Okay, let's take a look now at the upper left-hand side. We're going to read the exact same verse as it appears in a King James Bible. It's verse 16 again, only because the verses are divided up differently, but it is the same verse. Verse 16, upper left-hand side. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. Ladies and gentlemen, be honest, who does that sound like it's talking about? Jesus. What now? I asked you a moment ago when I read it to you from a Sonsino translation, and you all were silent. Somehow I just read the same verse, just the King James Bible, translating the very same verse, and you said it was Jesus. What word was changed? What word do you find there that tells you there's something Christological taking place? Pierced, exactly. The word pierced tells us, pierced my hands and feet. Well, that sounds like Jesus. Now, those of you who understand a little Hebrew, I've given you the Masoretic text, the Hebrew, on the upper right-hand side. Do any of you see the word pierced over there on the upper right-hand side of the Hebrew? No. What word is the Hebrew translating as pierced? What is the King James? What word is the King James Bible translating as pierced? The word ka'ari, those of you who don't read Hebrew, it's the third line, it's the Hebrew on the upper right-hand side, it's the third line down, it's the word to the extreme right, ka'ari. But what really does the word ka'ari mean? The word ka'ari doesn't mean pierced. The word ka'ari means like a lion. Ko'ari means like, no, it's a very, the word Ari, I'm sure those of you know it's a name for a man, Ari, Aryeh, right? It means a lion. In the English language, when we want to say like, L-I-K-E, well, we put the word L-I-K-E before the word. In the Hebrew language, we usually don't do that. We put a kaf before the word and it tells us it's like that thing. Ko'ari does not mean pierced, it means like a lion. Now, I know what some of you are saying here in this room. Some of you are saying, Rabbi, how do I know you're telling me the truth? Maybe the word ka'ari really does mean pierce, but the rabbis changed it to mean like lion because we wanted to deny the Christological message of Psalm 22. How do we know? And if, Rabbi, I'm inclined to believe you, well, my next door neighbor, the guy sitting next to me, he's not going to believe, right? How do I convince them? Is there a way that we can know? Is there some sort of way that we can begin to know which is the correct rendering of that word, ka'ari? Well, there's a very easy way to figure it out. In Bible scholarship, there's a very simple concept called clear and consistent. You can well imagine the word ka'ari and ari and all of its variations. This is not a word that appears only here. This is a word that appears in other places of the Jewish scriptures. Well, all we have, as a matter of fact, the word ka'ari appears 63 times, with all its variations, appears throughout the scriptures. It's a very common word. Well, the question becomes, well then, let's take a look at that word and how does the Christian Bible translate it into all the other places? If they're translating it as pierced in all the other places, well then, right? But if they're translating as like a lion in all the other places, we have a problem. That's exactly what's taking place. Every other time in the Bible where the word ari, aryeh, ka'ari appears, this word, or in all its variations appear, all the Christian Bibles correctly translated as like a lion. Only here is it translated as meaning pierced. I wonder why. I've done a little of the homework for you, just a little. You're going to have to do the rest yourself. And this is easy to do. All you do is open up a Hebrew concordance, and you look up the word ka'ari, and it shows you all of them, and you take out your King James, and you look them all up on your New American Standard. But if you go to section C, if you see we're on row A, if you go down to row C, I've given you a verse in Isaiah chapter 38, verse 13. It's just one example of that verse. If you look on the right side of the page, the first line, the Hebrew, where it says 13, in Hebrew it says, Shivisi ad boker ka'ari. Now, even if you do not read Hebrew, you could see that that last word, meaning the word on the left side, the first line, is exactly the same word as the third line over to the right. Yet, if you look on the left side of the page, how the King James translates that very same word over there, it says, I reckon till morning that as a lion. Why does that word in Isaiah 38 mean like a lion? And on Psalm 22, it suddenly means pierced. As a matter of fact, what becomes silly is that if they would only, the context, someone would look at the context, you'd realize that King David was using this as a metaphor. King David, without a doubt, is of course was the most illustrious king of Israel. All the righteous kings that followed him were always measured up against him. There is another side to King David's life, and that of course was a very tragic side. A person who was a fugitive before he became king and after. Many of his own family wanted to destroy him. He was on the run. King Saul wanted to kill him. And he described throughout the book of Psalms his adversaries as the lions and the dogs who were hounding him, who wanted to rip him to pieces. He does it before Psalm 22:17 and does it after. As a matter of fact, if you take the word lion, you look it up in the concordance, you will see that every time the word lion appears in the book of Psalms, it is used in respect not to actual roar lions, but it is used as to those who were his adversaries who wanted to destroy him. Look a little further. Look at row B, and I've given you a verse that appears in the very same psalm, just a few verses later. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling, from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth. Why does the word argue there suddenly doesn't mean pierced or some version of pierced? Suddenly back to lions again and dogs again. That's method number 2. You just change one word in the verse and suddenly it takes on a whole new meaning. Let's move on. No, don't turn your page. We're back in the book of Matthew. And now Jesus is brought back from the land of Egypt. The coast is clear. Herod is dead. Jesus is told that he can return. It's time to come back. He does not come back, however, to the city that he was born in. Jesus was born in what city? Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he doesn't come back to the city of Bethlehem. He now resides in a different city. The name of that city is Nazareth. However, Matthew wants us to know that just settling, taking up residence, getting your name listed in the Nazareth phone book is not an arbitrary event. No, that was a fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. Indeed, the Jewish scriptures told us that the Messiah had to be a resident of the city of Nazareth. Very simple thing, okay? Now, Matthew is going to give us the verse. Now, what I want to do is direct your attention to the extreme, the bottom of the page, and let's just read the verse, okay? Matthew 2:23. And he came and dwelt in a city called Nazareth, that it might be fulfilled, which is spoken by the prophet, he shall be called the Nazarene. By the way, anybody know where that verse is? Just like that. No. Anybody know? Yeah?
When people make themselves into a Nazir.
Right. Some Christians say that's what it's referring to, when people make themselves into a Nazir. No, but that couldn't be because, Samson, for instance, that couldn't be because, how do you spell Nazir in Hebrew, by the way? Nun, Zayin. And how do you say Nazareth? See, in the Anglican version, it sounds the same. But how do you say the city of Nazareth in Hebrew? Natsaris. And how do you spell Natsaris? All right, so they have as much to do with each other as the word cat and cab. There's no relationship between them, although they do share a couple of letters. No, that's not it. No, it's not, the Samson kind of thing. Anybody else want to? All these rabbis? Nobody? Chicago, they knew this. That's interesting. Nobody wants to even take a shot? Guess? Nothing? No. Don't feel bad. The verse doesn't exist. This verse is made up out of thin air. I know, but it doesn't have the same kick if he gets it. The verse doesn't exist. And that's method number 3. If you don't have a verse, you just make it up. Let's move on. Turn the page. As a matter of fact, some of you are saying, well, then probably is some verse that's like that exists. How is it possible that everyone believes in this? Wait, there's got to be something, right? Take questions at the end. Right? If you open a concordance, right? By the way, a concordance is a very important reference manual. What a concordance does basically is it gives you a list. If it's an exhaustive concordance, it's going to list every place any word appears with the surrounding few words. If you look up the word Nazareth, Nazarene, Nazar, anything, in a, let's say you take a Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible, which is certainly the most popular one around. He owns one, right? Right? If you look up those words, the first time that word appears is right here in Matthew 23. There is no listing for anything before them. In any context, in any way, the word Nazareth doesn't even appear in the Talmud. It doesn't appear anyways. Questions, as I said, later. Let's move on. Now, what we're coming to right now, in this area of polemical scholarship, is called, sometimes it's referred to as the textbook verse. It's certainly one that people are somewhat familiar with to some degree. Let me give you some background, okay? Now, as you all know, Christians disagree. That means different Christian denominations differ on many, many things. Things that are rather less significant to things that are very significant. Things, for instance, as the Trinity. For fundamentalist Christians, denominations that deny the divine nature of Jesus often get the name cult. So a group like Jehovah's Witnesses certainly would fall into that category. So you have many differences amongst different denominations of the Christian faith. There are some things, quite a number of things that they agree upon. One of the things that Christians agree upon, one of the issues that they agree upon, whether we go from the extreme left wing, from the Jehovah's Witness to the Greek Orthodox, is the fact that Jesus was born of a virgin birth. Now, which means that Jesus was not born out of the natural union of a man and a woman, the intimate union of man and woman. No, not at all. Jesus was born out of a virgin birth. Mary was a virgin. She had not been with the man until she conceived with Jesus in her womb. Now, although the 27 books in the New Testament, not all of them tell us this story. Actually, only 2 of them describe this to us, and you can find this virgin birth episode in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. Please, and also do not confuse this. Sometimes people confuse this with something called an Immaculate Conception. This is not the Immaculate Conception. That is a Catholic belief. Primarily, the Immaculate Conception means that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was born in a sinless state and she was not contaminated with the original sin. Now, in the book of Luke and Matthew, and this will be a classical example of 2 writers speaking to different audiences, Luke speaking to a Greek audience, Matthew speaking primarily to a Hebrew audience. So Luke tells us the story of Mary being born, Mary having a child in her womb while still at a state of a virgin. But Matthew not only tells us the story, but also gives us a verse to support it. Now, sometimes I get the question, Rabbi, wait right there. I don't understand the story. Sometimes I get the question, how is it possible that Mary was betrothed to Joseph? They were husband and wife. How was it that she was still a virgin? Let's be open, and we're adults here. Didn't they have a wedding night? Didn't she lose her virginity then? How is it that she was in the state of virginity? So I think that I would just briefly take out a moment to explain this to you. Those of you who have gone to a Jewish wedding and you observe it, it appears as if that Jewish wedding is one ceremony. Very beautiful ceremony, I think. Although it appears to be one ceremony, it really is 2 ceremonies that are combined into one. In the time of the temple, a person, when they got married, they didn't do it all in one shot, but it happened basically in 2 parts. The first thing was that when the man found the woman that he loved and she agreed to marry him, well, he gave her something of value, usually, a golden ring or something like that. And then she became betrothed unto him, but she didn't yet live with him. She went back to her father's house, and prepared for the wedding. He went back, planted a vineyard, began a business, built a house. 1 year later, she left her father's house and went to live with him as husband and wife, and they consummated their relationship. That was called Nisuin. There was usually a year period in between. Now, although sometimes I see some commentators using the word engagement, it's a poor translation, especially for a contemporaneous audience. Because, today if 2 people are engaged, and God forbid they break their engagement, as sad as it might be, they are not married. There's no divorce that has to be given and so on and so forth. But if, for instance, during that 1 year period, they decided to break up the relationship, he had to write her a bill of divorcement, just as if he had been living with her. Also, if during that year period she had an affair, she slept with another man, then the product of that union would be a bastard, would be a mamzer. And all the laws of being a bastard would apply to that child just as if she was fully married to that man. So although they hadn't consummated their relationship yet, they were married with regards to many of the laws of the Jewish people. And it was during this time, during this year interim period, that Mary suddenly finds a baby in her womb, and she knows she's never been with a man. Of course, when Joseph finds out about this, it's not good. He wants to put her away. Not publicly, because he was a righteous man. He wanted to put her away privately, quietly. Oh, but the angel of the Lord came to Joseph at night in a dream and said to him, Joseph, thou son of David, put not away Mary thy wife, for that which is in her womb was conceived of the Holy Ghost. And she's going to bear a son, and you name Emmanuel. And then Matthew goes on to give us a verse to show us that this wasn't an arbitrary event of an Olympic seduction. No! This was foretold by the Jewish prophet, Isaiah no less. Isaiah, who lived more than 7 centuries before this event, Isaiah is foretelling the Messiah being born of a virgin. Let's take a look at it inside. It's the upper part of the page. Okay, Matthew chapter 1, verse 20 through 23. I'll read it to you. But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. For that which has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. For it is he who will save his people from their sins. Now all this took place, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, this is the verse, this is the quote. Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God is with us. Behold, the virgin shall be with the child, and shall bear a son. If you had a Christian study Bible with footnotes in it, and it would tell you where to look, it would say that, take a look at Isaiah 7:14. That's where the verse appears. It wouldn't say it in those words, it would just tell you Isaiah 7:14. Isaiah 7:14 is where this verse appears. Now, what word in that verse that I read to you sounded Christological, like something funny is going on here? Behold, let's think in the English, I didn't read anything in Hebrew yet. Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son. What in that verse that I just read to you sounds like there's something very unusual taking place here, something sounding Christological? What word is that? Virgin. That's correct. Now, what I've done for you is I've given you the verse. I've done the homework for you. I've actually went to Isaiah 7:14 for you. I took the verse out, the Masoretic text, and there you have it there right across sort of the upper center area. Does anyone, those of you who understand the little Hebrew, do any of you see the word virgin in that Hebrew? No. What word, by the way, do you see there that the Christian translator, that Matthew is translating as a virgin? Alma. And what really in the Hebrew language does the word Alma mean? Actually means a young woman. It doesn't mean a virgin. Rabbi, how do I know you're telling me the truth? And if I'm inclined to believe you, how do I convince the lady next to me? Well, the word Alma is not as popular a word in the Bible as Ari and Kari is. It actually only appears 7 times. This is one of them. If you take out a New American Standard Bible, for instance, and you look up all the other places where the word Alma appears, you'll see it translates it as young woman and not virgin. Some people say to me, Rabbi, you know what it is? It's probably, you know why Isaiah used the word, young woman instead of virgin? It really means a virgin. But Isaiah, he was an Orthodox Jew. He was a very ehrlich, a very frum, we call it, very frum person, a very, very, retentive kind of guy. He didn't want to use, sexy, racy kind of terms like virgin. So he wanted to use a word, but we know what he means when he says young woman. It's young woman with a wink. Well, that's not exactly the way the prophets worked. Actually, although the word Alma is a very unpopular word, it appears only 7 times, the word virgin, by the way, how do you actually say the word virgin in Hebrew? Basula, actually the word betula appears over 120 times in the Bible. Christian translators now do correctly, if you take out a Revised Standard Version or New English Bible, they are going to translate this word correctly as a young woman and not as a virgin. Now, I will tell you that when I'm sitting with a Hebrew Christian who has come to see me and to speak to me, and this verse usually comes up within 15, 20 minutes, after going through this thing with the Alm, I say to them, you know what, forget about this whole thing, I'm a virgin now. Do you have any idea what the context of Isaiah 7:14 is? Do you have any idea? I mean, you know Isaiah 7:14 like that by heart. Tell me, what does it say in Isaiah 7:10? What does it say in Isaiah 13, Isaiah 15, without looking in? Very rare that the person will even make an attempt to tell me what is the translation. What's going on over there? That's what you get when you hire a New York lecturer. What's going on over there in Isaiah 7:14? What is the context? Is this verse somehow floating in the middle of biblical air? I mean, is there some context? What's going on over here? So let's take a look at what's going on. You know, as a rabbi, you get a lot of questions from obviously from different people. And one of the questions I get from Jewish people, especially, almost exclusively, is why are the Jewish people so divided? Why are we bickering so much? Why do we have all these denominations, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and this one doesn't like this one, and this one, you know, two Jews, right? If a Jew moves to a deserted island, right, he has to build two synagogues, one that he goes to regularly, one that he would never step foot into, you know? So, I mean, why do they do it? And this one doesn't accept this conversion, and he doesn't accept his kosher, and this one doesn't accept it. Why don't we get along better? I mean, there's so many anti-Semites, so many people are really not crazy about us. I mean, we should do a little whatever we are, we should stick together. You know, why do we, in general, Jewish people are for Jewish unity. As long as we do it my way, of course, but, you know what I'm saying? One of the things I usually share with the person I'm speaking to at the time is that we probably, if you go back in Jewish history, we probably never got along better. Certainly not since King Solomon. If you go back in Jewish history, there were times we were much, you know, we were really mortal enemies of each other. One of the worst periods in Jewish history was a period when the Jewish people indeed split into two kingdoms. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. When King Solomon passed on the reign, passed on the kingship to his son, Rehoboam, there was an outcry within the nation of Israel, within the Jewish people. King Solomon was an exacting king. He used an enormous amount of resources and manpower from the Jewish people. And when King Solomon passed away and his son became king, the Jewish people wanted a rest. They came to Rehoboam. We want make our lives easier. Don't be so tough like your dad was. And it was a protest. It was led by a man named Yerovam ben Yevot. What happens? Rehoboam didn't know what to do. He needed advice. First, he goes to the sages of Israel. Asks them, what do you think I should do? And they advise him, he says, go out to the people and comfort them. Tell them that things are going to be okay. Basically, you're going to make amends and you're going to make their lives easier. One of the great tragedies is that Rehoboam also went to his friends, young friends who he grew up with. And he asked them, what do you think I should do? And they said to him, just paraphrasing, they said to him, if you're going to give the people a finger, they're going to want a hand. You can't give them anything. You go out and tell the people that, your little finger is thicker than your father's loins, and that if my father whipped you with whips of leather, I'm going to whip you with scorpions. And the great tragedy was that he listened to his friends. Instead of the sages, he went out to the people and told them exactly that, and there was a revolt. The king of Judah had lost most of the kingdom. A new kingdom was set up called the Kingdom of Israel, and now you had two kingdoms, the Kingdom of Judah and the Kingdom of Israel. If you look at the biblical maps that appear in the back of a Bible, you will see that the Kingdom of Israel, the breakaway kingdom, which had basically 9.5 tribes, what they did not have was basically, obviously, the tribe of Judah stayed loyal to Rehoboam. The Levi, the tribe of Levi, stayed loyal to Rechavim, who all the Kohanim and Levites are from, and a part of the tribe of Benjamin stayed loyal. But the rest of the Jewish people went north to Samaria, and they set up a kingdom there. They had much greater resources and manpower. They had so much going for them. But they didn't have the pearl of the Jewish people, the temple itself. Oh, Jerusalem was in the hands of the kingdom of Judah. Yerovam ben Nevat didn't want his people going down to Jerusalem every year for the 3 holidays, because he knew that if the people would go down to Jerusalem, their hearts would wax warm. They would want to come back. They'd want to be a part of the kingdom of Judah and then finally kill him. So he prevented them from going and set up idolatry in the northern part of Israel. These 2 kingdoms went on for 160 years, and it was a very tragic relationship. They never came back as one kingdom. They never really, although there were times Yehoshaphat came together where there was alliances, but there was terrible wars that went on. There were many elements that characterized the 2 kingdoms, and the kingdom of Judah had many wicked kings, but they also had many righteous kings. They had little of both. If you study the different kings of Judah, you will notice that there were righteous and wicked, and it almost like jumped. It was like a righteous, then wicked, righteous, wicked. And that was devastating for the Jewish people, because if you had one king who set up great things and brought Torah and brought the fear of God and brought back the commandments to the Jewish people, his son would only come along and undermine everything and bring back the groves, the Asherah trees, like the Bible tells us, brings back Baal and so on. Undermines everything the father does, and of course when he dies, his son who's righteous will comes by and then undone, and nothing is accomplished. Although nothing is accomplished, or we should say little is accomplished, the kingdom of Israel had no righteous kings. They were all wicked, every one. The only contest they had was who was more wicked. But they were all no good. They were all idolatrous, and brought the nation of Israel, brought the kingdom of Israel to idolatry. Eventually, this kingdom of Israel was carried off. It's one of the great mysteries of Jewish history, world history. Jews usually play in the major leagues, so when it's Jewish history, it's usually world history. What ever happened to that kingdom of Israel? They were carried off to the north by Assyria and really have never been seen again. One of the great prophecies in the Bible, messianic prophecies, that one day God is going to reunite, God is going to bring back those lost tribes. But we are not with them today. What is taking place in the book of Isaiah is something that happened over and over again. These 2 kingdoms often will go to war with each other. They usually did not go to war alone with each other, but they would grab one of the Gentile nations that existed throughout the crescent and say, come, let us go against this one and undermine that one. Sometimes it was the kingdom of Judah that would grab a Gentile kingdom and go against the kingdom of Israel. And sometimes the kingdom of Israel would grab a Gentile kingdom and go to war against Judah. What is taking place in Isaiah 7:14 is that the kingdom of Israel grabs the king of Aram, the kingdom of the Aramaic kingdom, and says, come, let us go against the king of Judah. The king, his name of Judah at that time was Ahaz. Ahaz was a very wicked king, and some of you may have never heard of his name. He's not someone who's very popular. His son was extremely popular, and I'm sure that most of you will know him. His son was Hezekiah, an extremely righteous king. Of course, Hezekiah has a son whose name is Manasseh, who sits on the throne 55 years, and the worst of the worst. And we see right there the jumping of the wicked, righteous, wicked king, right there in that thing. What's taking place here in Isaiah 7? The 2 kingdoms, the 2 kings, Pekah and Ritzin, they're coming to war against Ahaz, who's held up in the city of Jerusalem. He's completely surrounded by these 2 nations, by these 2 kingdoms, by these 2 armies. And his knees are buckling. The prophet Isaiah comes to Ahaz, meets him by the place where people wash their clothes. Ahaz tries to hide himself with a washer's vessel. Isaiah confronts him, and he offers to show him a sign, because I want you to know that although these kingdoms are surrounding you and they wish to destroy you, I'm going to give you a sign. God is going to protect you, that these 2 kingdoms will not be able to wage war with you. Ahaz, at first a wicked man, tries to show himself to be righteous. He says, I don't want to test the Lord. Isaiah says, look, it's not for you because you're such a righteous man. It's for the house of Judah. He says, I'm going to show you a sign anyway. I'm going to give you a sign so that you will know when you will overcome these 2 kingdoms that wish to undermine you. And it begins with the sign. And the sign is, of course, as we read it, there's a young woman, whatever, who has a boy. Now what I want to do is and what he then, the next verse is that honey and curds will he eat, and he will know to reject bad and choose good, and before he knows to do this, you will conquer these two enemies. These two enemies will not be able to destroy you. They will be destroyed. Now what I want to do is I want to take this verse, Isaiah 7:14, which Matthew tells us is referring to Jesus and Mary, and I want you to put out of your head the whole virgin thing. Just forget about that. Let's try to make sense out of this verse if it's talking about Mary who has a baby Jesus. Okay? What's happening here is Ahaz is caught up in the city of Jerusalem, and Isaiah comes to him and he says, I'm going to give you a sign so you'll know when these two kingdoms that surround you, when they will be finished. He said, there's a woman whose name is Mary. She's going to have a little baby, Jesus. She's going to name him Emmanuel. And before that little boy knows the difference between good and evil, you're going to conquer these two enemies. That's 700 years from now. Don't you see this makes, what kind of comfort is that going to be to Ahaz? He's long dead and buried. What kind of help is that? It makes no sense. This can only make sense if it's a contemporaneous situation. And what is astonishing is that this prophecy is fulfilled contemporaneously. It's fulfilled right here in the next chapter, Isaiah, which is Isaiah's own child. And he says in 8:18 that God has used his own sons as signs to Israel. And we see in 2 Kings 16 and 15 that these two kings indeed were killed, were murdered violently, and that they could not wage war with Jerusalem with Ahaz. Take a look at the lower left-hand side of the page. Then Ritzin from 2 Kings 16 verse 5. Then Ritzin the king of Aram and Pekah the son of Remaliah the king of Israel went up to Jerusalem to wage war, and they besieged Ahaz, but could not wage war with him. And in 2 Kings 15, verse 29 through 30, Pekah is murdered violently, and in 2 Kings 16:9, Ritzin is murdered. The prophecy was completely fulfilled then. See, it makes no sense. Now I'll show you more. What does the word ha'alma mean exactly? Answer carefully. What does the word ha'alma mean exactly? Thank you. The word ha'alma actually means the young woman. In the English language, when we want to use a definite article, which tells us that we know what we're talking about, we use actually a word, the, before the word, and then we know that the speaker and the listener know what we're referring to. When I say a table, it can be any table. When I say the table, that means that the speaker and the listener both know which table we're speaking about. In the Hebrew language, we don't use the the, we don't use a separate word before the word in general. What we do is we put a hey before the word, and that hey tells us it's a definite article. Ha-shulchan means the table. By the way, what is that hey referred to in Hebrew grammar? Thank you. That whoever you are. The hey hayidiyah is referred to. Okay, I got a tougher one for you. What does hey hayidiyah mean exactly? The hey that tells us it is known. The hey, when it's the definite article, and it tells us that the speaker and the listener know what we are referring to. It is known. Now take a look again at what Matthew does to Isaiah 7:14. You see, the word there is ha'alma. If you're going to change alma to virgin, it should at least say the virgin. But look what Matthew does. Behold, a virgin shall be with child. You see, he can't leave the there because it would make no sense. If Ahaz was being spoken to Isaiah, Ahaz would have no idea who this woman was. She's not coming around for 700 years. So he changes the definite article into the indefinite article. Oh, now you got more, now it's making more sense. Sometimes people raise their hand, they say, Rabbi, I got a good one for you, you can use in your lectures. They say, Mary never called, Jesus was never called Emmanuel in the New Testament. Isn't that a good one? Jesus is never called. Not one place that Jesus is called Emmanuel. And says it that it has to be called Emmanuel. This is a little tricky, what is the word vikaros? It's on the Hebrew line. It's the third word from the left. What does the word vikaros mean exactly? You would know this. What does the word vikaros mean? Thank you. Perfect. Vikaros means she will call. There's a big problem here. She, that's Mary. She never called him Emmanuel. No problem. Take a look at what Matthew does with that as well. shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. Who are they? They live in Canarsie. What's the difference who they are? They become anonymous. We don't know who they are. See, but she never called him that. That's a serious problem. There are two primary responses that the church has used in order to respond to what I just said. You know, if there was a Christian apologist in this room, what would they likely say after they heard what I just said? I mean, Christians must respond with something. I mean, they've heard of this. Martin Luther spoke about this. How do Christians respond? And I think they're reasonable answers, and I think therefore they deserve the respect of being addressed, being looked at. The first answer goes like this. I know what you're saying, Jew, that Alma really means young woman. It doesn't exactly mean virgin. Of course, it can mean. But anybody here know when the first time the Jewish scriptures were translated into a foreign language? Does anybody know when? Septuagint. Right, the Septuagint, 250 BC. What takes place here? Rabbis, 72 learned rabbis, described in Tractate Megillah, 72 learned rabbis translate the Jewish scriptures into the Greek language. Certainly the most well-known translation of the Jewish scriptures. According to Jewish tradition, according to the Talmud, there were miracles attached to this translation, that each of the 72 rabbis was locked away into a separate cubicle, and each one did their translation. When they all came out, their translations were identical. Now, what is the significance and why? I don't want to get into that, but that's the Septuagint. Jewish scriptures translated 250 BCE. Rabbi used to say BCE stands for before the Common Era. 250 years, Jewish scriptures translated into Greek. Now, what the Christian will tell you is that if you look at the word that the rabbis translated for the word Alma in Greek, does anybody know what that word is? Parthenos, exactly. Where do you daven? So what happens is what the Christian will say to you is that if you look in the Greek scriptures, in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, the ones your own rabbis did, you will see that the word that the rabbis used to translate the word Alma is Parthenos, the very same word that Matthew was using in chapter 1. And what does the word Parthenos mean? Don't give me a whole big thing over here. Parthenos means virgin. So your own rabbis, I understand that perhaps Alma is not the most exact. It's not the most ideal way. There are maybe Alma is referring to a married virgin and all kinds of things, right? Though there's no evidence, right? But don't you see that your rabbis understood that this was a very special kind of Alma? This was the virgin Alma. This was the mother of the Lord. Okay, that's basically how that first argument goes. It's quite popular, and I think it deserves the respect of a response. Okay, now there are two responses to this point. The first response is that the word Alma, the word Parthenos, although it can mean a virgin, it doesn't necessarily mean a virgin. It can also mean a young woman. That's the first answer, a very simple answer. For instance, if you open up that same Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible, which is, he's not a Hasidic Jew, this is a Christian who put this together, right? In the back, there is a Greek-English dictionary. Right? Okay. And if you look up the word Parthenos there, this own Christian admits that the word Parthenos means young woman, maiden, or virgin. But you also see many times in the Bible where the word Parthenos is implied, where it couldn't possibly be referring to an actual virgin. One of the many places would appear in the book of Genesis, chapter 34, verse 2, 3, and 4. Any of you remember what's going on over there? Okay. What's taking place there is Dinah, the one daughter of Jacob, 12 sons, one daughter. The daughter of Jacob gets raped by Shechem. And after Shechem rapes her, Shechem then now he has a wonderful resume for his father-in-law, then says, I want to marry her. Take a look at this, 34 verse 2. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, that's Dinah by the way, he took her and lay with her and defiled her. Verse 3. And his soul clave unto Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the damsel, and spoke kindly unto the damsel. Verse 4. And Shechem spoke unto his father Hamor, saying, get me this damsel for a wife. Now, take a guess which word is used for the word damsel in the Septuagint for Dinah after the rape? Parthenos, exactly. Now, that's the first response to that. Okay? The second response I couldn't give you first, because if I did, this first one would become really irrelevant. And that is that the rabbis who translated the Jewish scriptures into the Greek never translated the book of Isaiah. They only translated the law of Moses. They only translated the 5 books of Moses. This, what we have today, is a Septuagint. This, what you have from the book of Isaiah and the book of Psalm, and all these Septuagint does not come from the rabbis. It actually comes, much of it comes directly from the Geniza of the church. It doesn't come from the rabbis at all. As a matter of fact, today's Septuagint, even of the 5 books of Moses, is not what was originally done by the rabbis. There are many ways we know that, but one of the best ways to know is that in Tractate in Megillah, and it's now available in English, if you see the amendments that the rabbis made in their translation, you will see that none of the 15 amendments are in today's Septuagint. So therefore, it's completely. By the way, those of you who are familiar with Greek, even if you have just a slight knowledge of Greek, you would see that the kind of Greek that's used in Isaiah is very different than the kind of Greek that's used in the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses, the Greek is a much higher Greek, the kind of Greek that you would find, maybe in the book of Luke, chapter 1, the first few verses, whereas the Isaiah, the Greek that's used actually is very similar to the New Testament type Greek, the Koine Greek, the kind of Greek that really was spoken by the common man. But there's one other point that Christians use that I think that really does require an address here. And this is how it goes. So what you're trying to tell me, Mr. Jew, is that Isaiah 7:14, this verse, the woman in there, she wasn't a virgin at all. This was a normal man and a woman. They slept together, they had sex, and then she gets pregnant. You're telling me that's what happens? She gets pregnant and has a baby? That's your sign? That's the sign? What kind of miracle is that? There's your miracle? That happens a million times a day, that men and women have sex and have babies. That's no miracle. But if this is talking about a virgin conception, if this is talking about a woman who was a virgin, who never been with a man, and she has a baby in her womb, now there's a sign, there's a miraculous birth. Where's the sign if it's just talking about an ordinary conception? Okay? It's a good point. And I think it requires some response. I usually respond to this point by actually telling something actually that happened a number of years ago in Chelsea. Chelsea is a suburb of Chicago. And what happened there was, Chicago, there's a lot of winds in Chicago, and Chelsea, of course, is not exempt from the and what happened was that because of the serious winds in Chelsea, that a lot of signs, street signs, stop signs, traffic lights, yield signs, they were getting blown down by the wind. And this created a number of problems for Chelsea. The first problem was it was very expensive to keep replacing the signs. The second problem was that a sign blowing in the air can hit somebody and it can be very, very serious. So the city of Chelsea decided they should arrange a town meeting, and it was in a room just about this size, about the same number of people in there, to figure out how to ameliorate the problem, what to do here. We have a serious problem. Oh, and there was tremendous bickering, things, people flying all over. Chicago was, and what happens? All of a sudden, about a half hour into the back and forth screaming, this, we should do this, we should do that, suddenly an elderly man with a long beard jumps out of his chair and says, "Hey, ladies and gentlemen, if you do what I'm telling you, you'll never have a problem in Chelsea again of signs getting blown down." So there was a hush in the room. He climbed on top of the chair and he says, "If you do what I'm telling you, if you take my advice with regards to Chelsea, you will never again have a problem with a sign getting blown down in Chelsea." He said, "No, so what's your advice?" He says, "All you have to do, instead of having all the signs in Chelsea above the ground, where the winds can blow against them and blow them down, why don't we take all the signs, every sign in Chelsea, and bury them completely, entirely, the whole sign, entirely under the ground, the whole thing, and then," what are you laughing at? What's so funny? In this way you won't have a problem. What's funny? What are you laughing at? What? So what if you can't see it? I mean, if you can't see it, it's not a sign? Again, if you can't see it, it's not a sign. One more time. If you can't see it, it's not a sign. Ladies and gentlemen, unless Mary had a big oak tag sign on the front, on the back, signed by the obstetricians and gynecologists of Judea, saying, we did an internal examination, and we hereby certify that Mary is a virgin, you can't see it. You see, the one thing about virgins is that you can't see if they're a virgin. You can't see it, and if you can't see it, it's not a sign. Maybe a miracle. See, the one thing in the Bible about an oath, about a sign is, it may not be miraculous, but it's certainly something that you can see. Ladies and gentlemen, tell me, what is one of the first signs in the Bible? Come on. Rainbow, exactly. What happens? God brings a deluge, brings a flood to the world. Right? And what happens, right? After the flood's over, God gives us a providence, makes a covenant with the world that he will never again bring such a flood. And what is that? What is that? It's a rainbow in the sky. Is a rainbow a miracle? Meaning, does a rainbow violate the laws? No, not at all. Rainbow is water particles in the air, light passing through it, and breaks it up into, right? It's not a miracle, but it is a sign. It's something that you can see. Ladies and gentlemen, by definition, virgin births cannot be signs. They can be miracles, but they cannot be signs. Usually, after a lecture like this, I get a couple of questions, usually also from the Jewish section of the audience. I usually get, question number one I usually get is, why is it that only 2 books this is rather, virgin birth, being born of a virgin, that's rather unusual, and that's just not something you come across every day. Why is it that only 2 books in the entire New Testament tell us the story? Shouldn't there be other books in the New Testament that tell us? Even certainly the Gospels, which actually tell us the whole life of Jesus, shouldn't they have? Why does only Matthew and Luke mention it? Why not John? Why not Mark? Why not some of the epistles of Paul? Why doesn't anyone even say it? On the contrary, and Paul says in Galatians 4:4, Jesus was born of a woman, doesn't even call her virgin. That's the first question I get. But the second question is more interesting. The second question I get is, why did Matthew do this? What did he need this for? What did he need this whole headache for? What did Matthew have to go? If the Jews truly were not expecting Messiah born from a virgin, then why did Matthew have to go and create a whole mythology that he was born of a virgin, then go find a verse in the Jewish scriptures, as we could see, that he mutilated it. This was not accidental. This was done, there was a lot of done very carefully here. Why did he do it for altogether? And then he has to go build it and this, and with the change of the articles and the different articles, and the she. What did he need that for? He should have left well enough alone and forget the whole idea. What did he need it for? I'd like to answer these 2 questions with one answer. Indeed, when the Christian faith began, it didn't even begin in seeing itself as a separate faith. Jesus, as I mentioned last week, when he was instructing his apostles, he said, only to go to the Jews, Matthew 10:5, right? Go not into the way of the Gentiles, the city of Samaritans, enter ye not. Only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Paul speaking the same way in the book of Romans, the Jew first, then to the Greek. Initially, the hope was to go to the Jew, that this faith would be the Judaism, would be the continuation of the Jewish faith with its Messiah. But what was happening was it wasn't working. The Jewish people en masse were rejecting the Christian faith. The Jewish people overwhelmingly, although they desperately could have used the Messiah at that time, the timing would have been perfect in terms of the brutal occupation of the Romans. There would have been nothing more they would have wanted than the promises of the Messianic age. They said, unfortunately, this man is not the Messiah. And it wasn't working. And the early teachers of the Christian faith realized it. Now, they wanted the Jews. You could see it with Paul, how in the book of Acts, and Acts basically is a story about Paul, at least from chapter 10 and on, at 9 and on, is the story of Paul. Paul begins his ministry. He only wants to go to the Jew, and he goes to the Jewish person, but it doesn't work, and he becomes frustrated, and then he goes to the Gentiles. He becomes a minister to them. But you see it in the book of Acts where it hurts him. His heart is yearning for the Jew, so he goes back to the Jew and tries to witness again, and only then again to be rejected by the Jewish people. In Acts 18:6, he actually takes his cloak off and he throws it down in the city of the Jews, and he says, I've had it with the Jews. I'm going to the Goyim. You want the Goyim? See, as the first century was evolving, As the first century was unfolding, clearly the founders of the Christian faith understood that if this faith was to survive, was to live, it needed Gentiles. It needed to attract the Gentiles from the Fertile Crescent. You want Gentiles in your religion, you better inject things into it that the Gentiles understood, that they were familiar with, that were comfortable with. And if you study the myths, cults, and religions that existed throughout the Fertile Crescent at the time of Jesus, you are going to find in virtually every one of them that their God was born of a virgin. Whether it's as much as Krishna or Buddha, Tammuz, vegetation god of Babylon, Isis, all these gods, the sun god of Egypt, all these gods all born of a virgin birth. So what had to happen was, you see, in the early, by the way, what are the first books in the New Testament? Anybody know? No, well, Mark is the first of the Gospels. What's the first of the books in the New Testament? Well, chronologically, which books were essentially written earliest? No. Right, the epistles of Paul. The writings of Paul are very early. Begin about the year 46 and end about the year 58. Not a word in Paul's writings. You know why? Because the hope was still for Jews. You don't need a virgin birth for Jews. What was the earliest of the Gospels themselves? Mark. Mark is written somewhere around the destruction of the first temple in Rome, written for a Roman audience. But still, nothing yet about a virgin birth doesn't make it into his writings. And Mark should have. Mark was the gospel. Mark was describing the life of Jesus, but he skips over this incredible birth. Mark doesn't say a word. You have to wait until you get to Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke, written about the year 85, 80, 95, 90, somewhere in there. At that point of the first century, as the first century was finally ending off, then you finally have the virgin birth that has made it into, because at this point, the founders of the Christian faith understood that in order for it to survive, Gentiles had to be brought in. Gentiles are going to require the things that Gentiles are used to from their mother faiths, namely virgin birth. And of course, only then do you have the last of the Gospels written, John. And of course, with the book of John, John chapter 1 opens up, of course, with the whole new idea, the Trinity. Finally. A number of years ago, there was a fellow who was actually only a few weeks away from becoming an ordained minister. He went to a place in Edison, New Jersey called Faith Fellowship Church there. And his parents begged him to meet with me. And he agreed that he would put off, until he would meet with me and spend time studying with me. And we spent quite a bit of time studying together. And finally, he came back to the faith of his forefathers, and he became back to Judaism. He's now studying in Esha Torah in Jerusalem. But I remember before he left for Israel to study, we were sitting in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, sitting in a place called the Cherry Hill Inn one Shabbat, which I understand doesn't exist anymore. But we were sitting in the lobby, and there was a whole Jewish conference taking place, so there were people in there singing Shabbos songs. And we were sitting in the lobby, and we were speaking about Shabbos, and as we were speaking, and I was talking to him, I noticed that tears were running down his face. He was crying. I said, "Glenn, what's wrong? Why are you crying?" He said to me, "Rabbi Singer," he said, "you don't understand. For 4 years, I was a Hebrew Christian. My parents only knew about it for 3 years. I broke their heart. The two people who loved me more than anything, I know I took years off of my father's life. My mother will never be the same. And all that time, they kept saying how I'm wrong, and I kept saying, no, I'm right, and you're wrong. Now we've studied together, we've learned. And now I see all that time, I was wrong, they were right. How can I live with myself? All the people I've hurt." When he finished speaking, I said to him, "You know, Glenn, all that time when you believed in Jesus and you were saying you're right, and then they were saying they're wrong, and they were saying you're wrong and they're right. You were right, they were wrong. And now that you believe what you believe, you're still right. They're still wrong." And he said to me, "What do you mean, Rabbi?" I said to him, for those years, for those few years that you believed in Jesus, you were giving your parents reasons that made sense to you. Your parents were giving you the dumbest reasons in the world why not to believe in Jesus. It's not Jewish. Well, why not? They will give you based on the information you were given, you made the right decision to believe in Jesus. But now that you studied with me, now that you opened your mind, you gave it a chance, gave your people a chance to be heard, and now you've decided to come back to the Jewish faith, you're right, but they're still wrong. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all the people, individuals, families we've helped over the years, do it for the right reasons. And I want to thank all of you for having me, and I especially want to thank the Federation. I want to thank Shomrei and Young Israel of Dayton for having me. Thank you all, and have a very good week.